And now, blue states versus red states. A COVID report card. That's the focus of tonight's angle. Last week we showed you economic and health data proving that while the COVID pandemic is, of course, one of the worst events in American history, the response to it by President Trump and most GOP office holders has been effective. The U.S. leads on testing. Our death rate is roughly similar to Western Europe's, and our economy is doing much better than Eurozone countries, including Germany. That's why investors are more bullish on the future of America. Now, despite Trump and the GOP's objectively successful handling of COVID, Joe Biden and the Dems insist it wasn't, and that they would have somehow done better. Biden tweeted today, "I promise you, if I'm elected, I won't waste any time getting this virus under control. I'll call Dr. Fauci and ask him to stay on. I'll bring together top experts and leaders from both parties to chart a path forward." Wait a second, is that his plan? Have Fauci and a panel of expert cronies just run the country? Now, even though Dr. Fauci recently said he didn't think more lockdowns were necessarily, well, you know that in his heart of hearts, I don't think he really meant it. And besides, Fauci has already come up with other ways to make your life more miserable.
There should be universal wearing of masks. There should be, to the extent possible, social distancing, avoiding crowds. Theoretically, you should protect all the mucosal surfaces. So if you have goggles or an eye shield, you should use it. But if you really want to be complete, you should probably use it if you can.
Travel in a spacesuit, my friends. Now, and if that wasn't horrifying enough, we already have a pretty good idea of how much worse things would have been under total Democrat control. Now, as the Angle has pointed out before, the U.S.'s COVID situation would look even better if it weren't for the bad performances in a few major blue states. And if our Trump-hating media hadn't smeared the early use of hydroxychloroquine, well, forget about it. We'd really be in trouble. My friends, the red states versus the blue states. What happened between the two? Now, there are 24 states with Democrat governors, okay? We also decided we're going to give credit, by the way, to Democrats from Maryland. It's really a Republic, but Governor Larry Hogan, although technically a Republican, he's repeatedly criticized President Trump's policies on the virus. And of course, in this analysis, we put the District of Columbia in the Democrats' camp. Now, that gives Team Blue roughly 184.8 million people. On the other side, Team Red has a population of 143.4 million people, okay? Now, both sides have a mixture of urban states and rural states, and from all major regions of the country. The most heavily populated state in the country, California, has a Democratic governor. But the next two largest states, Texas and Florida, have Republican governors. Now, for 5 months, officials on both sides have had a chance to adopt their own policies and address the virus. The blue states have generally favored stricter lockdowns and have basked in the glow of favorable press coverage. The red states have been more willing to trust their own people, a position for which they have been hammered.
That's how we arrived at this situation where you have mostly Republican-led states like Florida, like Texas, reopen too quickly, push everything you warned was going to happen has happened.
Death's so bad, they're piling up the bodies in refrigerated trucks.
You played politics with this virus and you lost. It was always science, and they were in denial, and denial is not a life strategy.
Now, let's forget all this rhetoric for a moment and just look at the facts. Worldometer has extensive COVID data at the state and national level, so we can see which approach works better. Now, number one, the red states have suffered 53,209 deaths, or a rate of 371 deaths per million. This figure, of course, represents a terrible tragedy. But the blue states have suffered 109,750 deaths, or a rate of 594 deaths per million. That's a 60% higher death rate than in red states. Now, here's another way to look at it. Last week, we compared the U.S. performance to 6 countries in Western Europe: Belgium, UK, Italy, France, Spain, and Germany. If we rank those 6 countries along with the red states and the blue states by deaths per million, you have a chart that looks like this. Now, I should also note that New Jersey and New York both have death rates twice as high as Belgium's, which is the second highest reported death rate in the world, according to Worldometer. Now, let's be clear. Every death is a tragedy. In this terrible, horrific pain caused by COVID-19, it's going to haunt all of us, this country, individuals, families, for many years. Every day we pray for a cure. But looking at this data, it is simply impossible to conclude that turning the country over to Biden and Harris will mean that we're going to have a safer, healthier society. These aggressive lockdowns, for the most part, have not worked as well as the GOP policy of trusting Americans, giving them some guidance, but trusting them to do the right thing. Now, President Trump couldn't stop the blue states from abusing these lockdowns, but what he could do, and what he did, was to limit the resulting economic harm by allowing the rest of the country flexibility to manage the virus in a much more, it's a generally more balanced and effective way. Now, imagine if we had followed the advice from all the Biden supporters that you see on TV all day long. Millions more Americans would be out of work. Every school in the country, every school, would be closed this fall. No one could go to church. You bet no sports, forget about those. And as you can see from the data, would almost certainly have more deaths. President Trump and his trust in the American people, his belief in liberty, saved us from this fate. But it's not over. The Democrats and their allies are still hoping for a national lockdown.
You cannot consider opening in most states in the country now because their transmission rate is way too high.
Do you think it's time for another shutdown, whether nationally or perhaps in certain pockets around the country?
I do think in certain areas you probably really do need to look at doing that.
That's what we end up having to do in order to try to regain some sense of control when the flu comes in and when colds come in and people are largely indoors. I think that's what we need to do.
Can you hear this? Are you listening to this? If they were in charge, we would be endlessly going in and out of lockdown. Like what's happening now in New Zealand. After supposedly eradicating COVID weeks ago, the government is dragging Auckland, its largest city, back into lockdown over a massive outbreak of, wait for it, 4 cases. All of which are in the same family. It's crazy. Don't think the Democrats aren't going to pull the same stunt here. They will, especially in the run-up to the election. Liberal governors see this real estate, they see the real estate numbers, both commercial, residential, they know people are leaving, and they know that people will flee these cities and states to places where their freedoms are respected, where criminals are punished, and where business is actually encouraged. Kids can go to school. They know that if you give people a choice, leaving blue states, go to red states, they'd rather be free to make their own decisions and not be bossed around by the type of incompetent administrators running blue states, right now running blue states, their economies into the ground. If these political pathogens take the White House and impose national restrictions, no one, except of course the rich and powerful, will be able to escape. And all you suburban women out there, remember this. Voting for President Trump, it doesn't mean that you like everything he's ever said or tweeted or done. It's a vote for your family, your kids, your community, your freedom, and by the way, it's also a vote for your pre-COVID way of life. And that's the angle.